Reparations. It's my money and I need it now. In 1619, the first captive slave is reported to have arrived in the Jamestown colony, but enslaved Africans arrived in North America in the early 1500s, working in the profitable sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton fields without pay. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery. This meant the emancipation of nearly 4 million enslaved Africans and African descendants. At this time, slavery was more valuable than banks, railroads, and factories combined. The 13th Amendment was passed, but not fully adopted. Over the next 100 years, generations of black Southerners were forced back into enslavement, with some gaining their freedom in the 1960s. On the top left corner, you can see an article published in Atlanta, Georgia, Wednesday, May 27, 1903, with the title of Negroes Held in Servitude, another being Negroes Still a Slave. While doing research, I found the story of the Miller family interesting, with May Louise Miller and her brother Arthur Miller being some of the few to speak out about their enslavement experience after gaining freedom in 1963 and in 1965. Arthur Miller speaks of his experience in a Vice interview in 2017, providing a first-hand experience through film for generations to come. Their story is confirmed by public records and by Antoinette Harley, also known as the slave detective of the South. Over her career, her work has helped to unravel the extent of slavery as well as the extent of the true length of time it existed. After being freed, African Americans had few economic resources. They received no 40 acres and no meal, but needed a way to save their earnings and acquire wealth. Freedmen banks were created by the federal government in 1865, soon after the Civil War. At its peak, there were 37 branches in 17 states by 1873. This was a good idea in theory, as it would allow newly freed African Americans a chance to receive loans to purchase land and to receive financial advice. The banks failed and closed in 1873, leaving some with a portion of their wealth and others with absolutely nothing. This was due to the First National Bank offloading their liabilities onto the Freeman banks without acknowledgement. The collapse of the first bank for African Americans has shown lasting effects, showing how the power of financial inclusion can lead to economic empowerment as well as the devastating effects of financial exclusion. After enslavement, African Americans struggled to gain upward mobility and financial security due to the lack of job opportunities, land grabbing, and stealing by white Americans, which was done by killing or intimidating African Americans until they left and claiming their land soon after. African Americans also faced discrimination and death due to the color of their skin, redlining, forcing them to live in the less desirable parts of town, and home mortgage prevention acts, keeping them from receiving loans to buy homes or to start businesses. The idea of reparations is to make up for the free labor used to build the U.S. economy, the effects of slavery, and economic exclusion. According to William Darty Jr., an American economist and researcher and professor at Duke University, the wealth gap represents the negatives African Americans have faced since entering this country as enslaved people. If the wealth of the U.S. was divided equally, African Americans would receive roughly 13% of this, as they make up roughly 13% of the population on paper. But instead, they hold around 3% of this wealth. It would take 10 to 12 trillion dollars to close this wealth gap. This would come out to roughly a $250,000 to each descendant of enslaved people in America today. A little more than half of the US GDP of 21 trillion in 2020. The fear of certain inflation and economic downfall is one reason preventing the government from taking action. Another option in terms of reparation would come with baby bonds. Baby bonds are similar to trust funds and would be given to every baby born in the US. Baby bonds are meant to make economic wealth more equal. This money cannot be touched until the person has reached young adulthood, whether that is 18 or 21. For those in disenfranchised or impoverished communities, they would receive more compared to those who are not, with African American babies expected to receive more funds. This would have this would have to continue until the flow of wealth is suitable and sustainable for the following generation. Let's say the baby on the left is from a financially stable background and the baby on the right is from an impoverished community. By the time of young adulthood, the baby on the left would be 16 times wealthier on average than the baby on the right. With the introduction of baby bonds, the baby on the right would receive more in terms of initial funds. In the model provided by Naomi Zued, an assistant professor at the City University of New York, the baby on the left would now only be 1.4 times wealthier than the baby on the right, drastically closing the wealth gap. Closing the wealth gap would open up the world to African Americans, allowing for investing in the Black community through Black owned businesses, Black owned banks, education, investment, and to push for self dependency. This would provide economic and financial liberation to the African American community. A great way to spend this newfound wealth would be to invest in Black communities. This could be done by investing in Black-owned businesses, Black banks, financial education, and African-centered aid and ideals. This knowledge would then be passed down to members of their communities, or better yet, their children. If this knowledge is absorbed early on, it would also lead to better financial decision-making skills early on in life. Introducing and instilling financial knowledge onto the next generation will provide a means to further closing the gap towards security and upward mobility.
Tell them to bring me my money. Yeah.